Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. Going into 2021, the pandemic is now killing more people, shutting down more nonprofits and small businesses, along with wiping out the livelihoods of families, neighborhoods, and communities. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
But we think that part of recovering at a grand scale in this country and in communities is actually going to be specifically about the performing arts, because there's something there that can be delivered to people to say, okay, we're on the other side. We made it.
Meg and David, could you please introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. And so happy to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. My name is Meg Friedman, and I'm a senior consultant at AMS Planning and Research, which is a boutique management consulting firm based in Southport, Connecticut. We serve clients across North America in the arts and culture space. We do strategic planning, feasibility studies, benchmarking, program evaluation, and a range of other things specifically for arts and culture clients. And prior to joining AMS in 2016, I was a stage manager for a bit over a decade and worked in over 30 states with a bunch of not-for-profit and commercial theater producing and dance producing organizations. Cherished the experience, learned a ton. And over the years, I found that there's a really interesting gap in knowledge around performing arts workforce motivation. So that's been a research interest of mine for a long time. And in joining AMS, I'm very lucky to have a company that is small and nimble and supportive of folks pursuing their personal research interests. Principal Stephen Wolf and Managing Director Michelle Walter have been especially supportive of folks exploring these areas. And I'm grateful to them for letting me do this side hustle called Return to the Stage.
Thank you. That was great. And David?
I'm David McGraw. I'm based in Greensboro, North Carolina. I'm currently serving as the program coordinator for the Arts Administration major at Elon University. We have approximately 80 undergraduates who are studying arts management. I am also a lifetime stage manager. I have been stage managing for 26 some years, and I'm currently serving on the board of directors of the Stage Managers Association, which is a national advocacy group. I first started studying stage managers as a subfield of performing arts managers back in 2006. And I began a national study then because as a group, it's just very hard to connect. It's a very decentralized, loosely connected field. Many times workers in the performing arts, particularly stage managers, might have multiple employers over the year. They might travel either on tour or finding seasonal work. So to study this group of workers is very challenging. And so over 7 iterations of my study, we've grown to over 1,700 stage managers participating and being able to find these groups and how they are connected and what really serves them most. So I started off with stage management. From there, I actually built out a little. I managed to get a fellowship so that I could work with Ronelle Jordan, who's based at the University of Cape Town. And we actually studied the South African creative sector, looking at not just performing arts, but also looking at technical fields. And then I got contacted by Meg, who said, well, maybe we could expand this study.
And that's where our adventure begins. Meg and David, welcome to Voices of the Community. After going through your return to the stage studies, I really wanted to host you on the show so that you could share with the audience what the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is having on our performing arts workforce, your findings, insights, and recommendations. And of course, I'm a longtime stage manager, but most recently I've been working as a front of the house manager and usher at, shout out to SF Jazz, City Arts and Lectures, and the Herbst Theater Group here in San Francisco. So of course, this is near and dear to my heart and all of my fellow workers, and not many people are doing this kind of a study. So let's begin, David, with you providing a little background on Return to the Stage study.
Certainly. So when the pandemic hit, we all immediately went into shock, right? The entire performing arts field, along with most of America, shut down, it felt like overnight. And then after the first few weeks, that shock transformed into this feeling of helplessness, of wanting to do something, but not knowing what to do since all of our regular channels have been broken. And so at that point, Meg contacted me to see if there was a way that we could connect people. And that's really at the heart of our study.
And Meg?
Picking up exactly where David left off, I wrote to David thinking, there's a gap. There were tons of surveys. There are still tons of surveys, but most of them were really about money and performances. So they were very, very grounded in employer perspectives and very high level, appropriately sort of what does a federal level legislator need? But we saw that there was an urgent need to start documenting the human impact over and above dollars lost, shows canceled, miles not traveled. We needed to know how people were feeling. And because we're not psychologists, we're people of and in the field of performing arts, we sort of created a stage manager's check-in in the survey. Are you feeling stressed, hopeless? We pulled some questions from the Census experimental data project called the Household Pulse Survey. And we pulled a bunch of really terrific questions that David has developed over the years in that stage manager survey. And we created a way to check in with folks every 6 months in 3 waves: July 2020, January 21, and coming up, July 2021. We'll send out the 3rd chunk of this survey.
So Meg, just following back up on that, what would you say is one of the main purposes of the study and, of course, lassoing your friend David into this process?
Understanding what's actually going on in people's heads. Not just how much they've lost, but what they aspire to, how they're coping, how they're feeling now, what they think they might want going forward. Not in very concrete terms, because we just can't predict the future. But one of the questions that we asked is, do you think you'll stay in the performing arts over the next 5 years? We're not holding people to this, but the sense that people might need to leave the field or want to leave the field is a really important gauge for the fabric of this industry. So that's one of the things we're collecting.
And I would just add to that, there are a number of great foundations that can pull up the data on employment figures, but no one was really asking the perceptions. So we could see some of the facts and the hard data, but really what was the experience for the individuals? So we wanted to focus this study on the individual worker in the performing arts, whether that's a performer or a technician, whether it's someone who works in fabrication for materials or front of house operations. Really, what is that individual experience?
Going back to the whole context of it, so it sounds like, David, you've been at this for a while. Meg came up with the idea of this bigger project, perhaps, and then you guys came together. So what would you say is the kind of criteria of the study itself?
The participation in the study was originally designed for anyone who has worked or volunteered in the performing arts in the United States between March of 2019 and March of 2020. And we recognize that within the performing arts, oftentimes it's a gig economy. So there may be months where you might be working in other fields. So we wanted to leave that year window open to get a sense of where people had been just prior to the pandemic. And then we could see what the current impact is.
So first, there was a challenge of people who were just working when they were working. We all know the on again, off again nature of it. But when you're on, everyone is on and on for 7 days straight, usually, or more. So now the whole thing shuts down. Everyone scrambles to try to survive. How difficult was it to actually get people to participate?
Oh, it was extremely difficult to find people. Once we found them, a lot of people wanted to participate, shared it with a number of their friends and colleagues. But really, if you think of the performing arts, we're sort of this big family, but there's not these strong connections. There's all these people who are coming in and leaving over the course of several weeks. And so we also found that a number of people were moving right at the beginning of the pandemic. Either they had lost employment and they were returning home, or they were suddenly deciding that home was rather an expensive place to be when they had a work shutdown. So suddenly those contact lists, those mailing trees, the phone trees, just weren't really working as people were moving around too much. So we ended up moving a lot of our study to reach people through social media, because we could still find people in that way, and finding sort of these clusters of, oh, yes, I know this group is now kind of occupying this other space, or we can at least make the one-to-one connections.
Meg, could you walk us through the waves?
Absolutely. So we have deployed 2 of the 3 waves imagined for this study. We field each wave for 2 weeks, just 14 days, so we can get a really tight snapshot of what's going on without making people feel rushed or frantic to complete the survey once they start it. The first wave was the first 2 weeks of July 2020. The second wave was fielded the first 2 weeks of January 2021. And the third wave, we certainly hope, will be fielding July 1st through 14th, July 2021.
And our choices behind that were really based on the seasonal nature of our work, right? When people will know their summer touring schedule, or oftentimes performing arts schedules align with sort of the academic year. So by the end of July, you should know what your fall looks like. We were really hoping that July 21 would be people looking in the rearview mirror at the pandemic. It's still obviously going to be with us, but at least we'll have a sense of the optimism or the pessimism at that point.
And then, David, you really wanted to make this study independent. It's not being underwritten by Reed Large Foundation or large theatrical production house.
That's right.
Well, our goal in doing it as an independent study was to make sure that everyone felt their voice could be heard and that it would not be used for other purposes. Even to say this was an academic study, we might not have had the buy-in. We've just found that in performing arts, a lot of people are maybe rightfully suspicious of how is this going to benefit me or how will this be used in the long term. So as 2 people who are working in the field, I was in a technical rehearsal and then suddenly I was unemployed. And so to know that we're on the ground, and in many cases, we are also impacted the same way as the participants in the study.
Meg, do you feel like there's a demand for the study? I mean, obviously you're in the business, so there's that demand because you really wanted to figure out what's going on. But is there a demand, you think, in the marketplace from workforce providers, from the Department of Labor, statistically, et cetera?
I can't speak to the federal agency demand level, but we've had really material interest from performing arts employers and the performing arts workforce itself. We have well over 2,500 people on a mailing list, which says volumes. When you surrender your email address to a new thing, in today's climate, that's not done flippantly. And we have had altogether over 4,000 people complete the survey in the 2 waves that we've done. We had 3,300 people complete the first wave in July 2020, and over 2,000 people completed the second wave in January 21, many of them having signed up in July and a bunch of new people joining on. So when people participate not once but twice, that suggests that there's substance there.
And that gets back to, David, your point about sustained interest from the participants.
Right, from the participants. And now we're seeing also from some of the employers, some of the advocacy groups, some of the organizations that are serving the field. That, certainly while we want to maintain the independence of this study, we do hope that our findings can be used by everyone as we plot a way forward.
So staying with you, David, can you provide us a little overview of what the methodology of the study was?
Sure. So once we identified that we wanted to look at both performing arts workers, regardless of what part of the performing arts you're in, we also want to look at volunteers. One of the earliest surprises that we had was just how many people who work in the performing arts also volunteer in the performing arts. So we found of our initial group, only 4% were saying they were strictly volunteers. But 48% said that they not only worked, but also volunteered. So when they had time off, what did they do with their free time? They went right back to the performing arts. So that was interesting to see that level of loyalty to the field. And then many times people would volunteer in a different discipline or a different work position. So to see some of those initial ways. We also wanted in the design of this survey to make it as simple as possible for the participant. And knowing that some of our questions could potentially cause trauma as people are reliving a very difficult part of their lives. So in creating the study, actually, if you look at the back end of it, it's actually 5 different surveys put together so that we can be very strategic of only asking the questions we need to of any one participant. And then we can build out from there and do more of the labor after the fact.
So anyone was eligible. You could be in the front or back of the house, technician, et cetera, or a volunteer. Meg, talk a little bit about informal networks.
So to David's point earlier, this industry, whatever genre you work in, whether you're in the circus space or dance or theater or opera or music or the many other genres, new and old, it's very much built on who you know. And we found one effective way of getting the word out was by asking people to be sort of evangelists, asking people who perhaps like stage managers send out a message on a regular basis to a list of 5, 10, 30 people. Can you send this to a few people? Your personal endorsement can help us get more data, and the input is anonymous. We'll never share data that could reveal a person's identity. So in July, this made a lot of sense. Some shows had shut down, and there were a few stage managers who agreed to send it out to their most recent distribution list. Maybe 1 or 2 of them had a distribution list of 50 actors, directors, designers, company managers, and so forth, who got a personal email from someone they were used to getting emails from saying, hey, this is happening. If you have a few minutes, please consider participating. So leveraging that sort of existing loose and strong social network was a really powerful way to get started.
Staying with you, Meg, could you walk us through the research and your analysis of it and the COVID-19 impact on the performing arts workforce? Paint a picture of what you both have heard from performing arts workers over this last year.
Absolutely. We hypothesized, and the data bears out, that these workers are enormously resourceful. They've applied to 3, 4, 5 or more kinds of financial relief program and pursued these things. And it's not check the box and move on with your life. They've helped each other a lot. David can talk a little bit about the types of coping strategies that folks have used and what they've leaned on and learned about in terms of coping with this time.
So yeah, we were looking at these strategies. And when we kind of say broadly coping, it's really how people were addressing their current needs and how quickly they were able to pivot. So we were asking questions about physical and mental strategies. So this could be something as simple as exercise or meditation. We were also, though, looking at socialization. So were people staying in contact? And really, that was also one of our goals of the study, is that we didn't want to just kind of extract this information, but we wanted participation in the study to itself do good, to connect people, to let people know that their experiences are not unique, that there are others who are going through something similar that they can hopefully bond over. We also saw that a number of people use this as a chance to organize their lives or to take on new learning or career development strategies as they're thinking what the future holds. And not surprisingly, so many people in the study were using creative strategies. So even though they weren't being paid to be creating new art, they were still making the art. It gives them the satisfaction and fulfillment. But then the last of the strategies we looked at, the 8th strategy, we were actually a little surprised at some of the numbers there, and that was on activism. So many people in the performing arts are turning to activism, whether that could be civic engagement through voting, or it could be through other measures of giving back to their community, but feeling like this is part of what they do, is part of their identity. And so to be able to see the ways that performing arts workers use all of these strategies to both care for themselves and care for their communities.
And it seems like in reading it, the two that stood out for me were the creativity component of it and the civic engagement component of it. Those appear to be the two big ones that a higher percentage of people engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, some of the numbers are just extraordinary, that 88% of the participants had voted that year. Over 60% had not only given to a charity, but had given to a new charity. So even though we were hit with record numbers of unemployment, people were still finding ways to give back. And that's really just so encouraging, because sometimes the performing arts can be seen as its own sort of discipline or siloed or traveling workers. But really, so many people are about, how do I improve my own community?
Meg, turning to you, just like the larger economy / society, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been impacted immensely by both the pandemic and the subsequent economic meltdown. How has that loss within the performing arts community of Black, Indigenous, people of color impacted them more so than the general population inside the workforce?
I'm grateful that you're asking a question, and I do want to emphasize that I'm a white researcher, so I can speak about the people who chose to participate in this study, but I'm not going to suggest that I could speak for these individuals. What we do see is that activism is especially evident in the Black, Indigenous, and people of color performing arts workers who participated in Return to the Stage. We don't know what type of activism they participated in. We didn't ask that question because we don't consider that our purview, candidly. And perhaps the more striking and even concerning thing is that these respondents reported a pronounced and somewhat growing inclination to leave the field. Before COVID, about 11% of these respondents indicated that they might exit the field in the next 5 years. In July 2020, that percentage went up to around a quarter of BIPOC respondents. And in January 2021, the percentage saying they might leave the field in 5 years rose again to be almost a third of BIPOC respondents. So this is a big difference from the overall BIPOC and not BIPOC respondents we're hearing from, where the inclination to leave declined between July 20 and January 21. And this suggests some pretty big questions for performing arts employers and other sort of, in not-for-profit parlance, we might call them stakeholders. How can performing arts employers make themselves really competitive if they've promised to hire more BIPOC folks if the talent pool is actually shrinking or is actually at risk of shrinking for a great variety of reasons? And perhaps is the inclination to leave the field sensitive to things that could be changed pretty quickly, like wages? Or, and I would hypothesize that are deeper cultural changes needed in addition to a set of fast and easily accomplished changes? The only answer to that is time. But these are big and important questions. And right now, the data suggests that the flight risk, if you will, is a big thing to pay attention to.
So staying with that, Meg, where do we stand now? That was a nice profile of the workforce. So as of the end of your second wave, which you just finished at the end of January, where do we stand with regards to this workforce? And follow on to that is not only the workforce, but the industry that the workforce serves.
So in very broad terms, and this is our respondents, not the federal data, total unemployment among Return to the Stage respondents declined from 56% unemployed in July 2020 to 49% in January 2021. And almost all of that recovery is in part-time work. It is significantly stopgap. So we can't expect that will retain people in the field for the long term. And in the most dire terms, we're looking at career loss, not just job loss. There's evidence that there's real hope. There are things that employers can do that sort of community agents can do to mitigate people leaving.
And I don't know if it's ironic or whatever you would call it, that we're actually saying that unemployment at 49% is an improvement. When this pandemic began, the lingo, the jargon used was that we're on an intermission, right? The performing arts are on an intermission. We're on a pause. Now that we're a year into this pause, we have to wonder who will be coming back. A number of people with very transferable job skills have had success in other markets and other industries. Will they decide to return, or will we lose not only those skills, but those experiences? Will we lose some of our seasoned workers in all disciplines? And what will be that kind of new starting point? When we were looking at the attrition rates, we were also looking at whether you were currently employed or currently unemployed or furloughed or laid off. And what's interesting is that attrition rates for those employed are about the same, are about holding steady over the course of the first 6 months of the study. If you are unemployed, there's actually a little bit of glimmer of hope that people who are still unemployed are actually more hopeful that there will be a return. They see some promising indications. So that's one thing that leads to some level of hope and optimism that some of these positions will be coming back. We just want to see who will be there to take them once the positions and the organizations reopen.
Which leads me to my follow-on question there, which is what has the industry's reaction been? The performing arts organizations, whether it's nonprofits, but all of the for-profit producers that are out there.
So the reaction has been largely positive, with the footnote, huge footnote, that many employers are still grappling with their own institutional survival. There are a very, very small number of organizations who are thinking about bringing workers back at all. I really can't think of any other than perhaps Disney, who are thinking about bringing workers back at a scale similar to what was in February 2020. I think I can speak for both David and myself when I say I think the value of this study will likely become clear in another 6 to 12 months when we've gotten closer to herd immunity and employers are more materially ready to come back, to rehire, to reassert live events, not like little slices of program necessarily.
What the study is also finding is how the communications were managed at the shutdown is having long-term effects that we will feel for years. That we were asking participants, how was your layoff, your furlough handled? And have you been contacted by your former employers? We're seeing this in many sectors, many parts of the nonprofits, also commercial organizations. How are they setting up for these former employees? How are they maintaining these channels of communication? And so what we're seeing already is the likelihood of returning to work really being based on the experience, the perceptions of how that furlough was handled, how clearly or how much the organization was really protecting itself when it could have been doing more to protect its workers.
Now that you've done 2 of the 3 waves, what would you say are the next steps? Because to Meg's point, there's this like 4 to 6 month window before we have, depending on whose subject matter expert scientist you believe, whether it's 70%, 90%, 85%. So what are some of the recommendations, findings, insights that you would provide government, employers, the workers themselves that have come out of the studies?
Well, again, acknowledging that we're not psychologists, but we have a great appreciation for people in that whole family of professions. The data that we have on experiences of anxiety and despair tell us that making room for people to feel their feelings is going to be enormously important for everyone. There will be unexpected pauses for applause and possibly weeping when someone walks back on stage. We've all been in a performance where a virtuoso walks on stage and the house just blows up and everyone's on their feet clapping. It's going to be like that every place for a while. It doesn't matter if it's Yo-Yo Ma gets that, because he's Yo-Yo Ma and he should, or if it's the middle school production of Lion King Jr. The return to live is going to cause a profound emotional response that will have peaks and valleys, but also has a long, long, long landscape to it. And one of the really interesting things that we've seen in the performing arts workforce in comparison to the general population, frequency and experiences of uncontrollable worry and hopelessness are actually higher. But over the 6-month arc that we have information for, the July 20 to January 21 window, performing arts workers actually saw a decline in their levels of hopelessness. They're less hopeless, if you will, 6 months on. And what that tells us is that this workforce actually has some kind of special fortitude, a unique fortitude, a capacity to find joy in the context of adversity and uncertainty. And that's really important to keep thinking about. We're going to keep exploring it in the 3rd wave of the study in July 21. But we think that part of recovering at a grand scale in this country and in communities is actually going to be specifically about the performing arts, because there's something there that can be delivered to people to say, okay, we're on the other side. We made it.
We also wanted to press further on that issue of activism. What did that mean for at least these 2,000 survey participants who addressed those questions? And so we asked them, what do you think should be the priorities as we all move forward together? Without a doubt, it was vaccination. 97% of survey participants would get a vaccine as soon as possible or as soon as their doctor recommended it. Everyone across the board, no matter how we slice the data in terms of different demographics, everyone put vaccination at the top of the list. What was interesting then is after vaccination, how people saw our next set of priorities. So for some, it was about increasing worker protection. There's a number of movements out there right now about reducing work hours per week or improving a work-life balance. For others, it was public funding, governmental support, or maybe just governmental recognition is about having more of a voice in government. For others, it was addressing racism, particularly systemic racism within the performing arts. And for others, it was protecting small businesses. Because we have to remember, too, for many performing arts workers, they might be owner-operators of their very own business. They might be that solo gig worker. What was really interesting, though, when we went to that second level of priorities is to see some of the distinctions based on the gender identity of the participants. So I identify as male, and I just want to state that as I give this next statement. As we looked at it, everyone across the board listed it as vaccination first. Then, though, among the male identifying participants, they rated worker protection, funding, and addressing racism less than the female and the non-binary, transgender, or gender non-conforming counterparts. Male identifying participants rated more highly representation in government and protection for small businesses. And I bring this up because there's been a number of conversations about how the performing arts historically have been male dominated in the higher ranks of leadership. And as we have this pause, this lengthy intermission, are we going to see changes in that leadership structure? And will those changes then perhaps lead us to changes in priorities or values for these organizations?
Really great insight. So how can the audience who's listening to this and the general public support your studies and support artists?
Oh, gosh. Keep paying attention. Stay involved. As much as you can, safely and reasonably, be at the show, whether it's on your computer or in a park or outside a venue or in a venue, masked and socially distanced and not sharing food. Just stay connected. Performing arts organizations are working incredibly hard with a skeleton staff, many of them, to stay connected with audiences. So people are being showered with emails, encouraging them to do all sorts of things. Please open them. Please try to participate. And when you feel safe going out again, whenever that is, and it will be the right time when you decide it's the right time, keep the performing arts in mind. If you're craving a trip, if you just have to leave your town or your state or your time zone, think about a show as the centerpiece of your trip. And you can make it the main course and build in lots of delicious sides around it, a museum visit, a hike, a bike ride. But think of a show and that thing that only happens at a live performance, where you get to hear or see something that has actually never happened before happen in front of you, done by often brilliant artists who have your enjoyment top of mind.
David, if someone who's front of house, back of house, volunteer, etc., how can they participate?
We would love if you would participate in the study. As Meg mentioned, we have one more round taking place in July. If you visited www.returntothestage.com, you could join the mailing list and be invited to participate in that next study. You could also read the full reports. Meg and I both love the research and plenty of graphs on that if you want to read more about any of these questions. But this is a community project, so there's also an opportunity at the bottom of the website that if you have a question that you think we should pose on the next wave of the survey, what do you want to know? Or is there an experience that you don't think the first two reports addressed? Let us know. I mean, this is part of artists helping other artists, performing arts workers really as one family. So let us know how we can make your voice heard as well.
That was great. So final question for both of you. Start with you, Meg. Out of the year plus of the pandemic and the economy that's completely melted down and somewhat coming back, but not performing arts organizations, what are some of the good things that you could see coming out of our pandemic and the economic meltdown that would support performing arts, but more importantly, the performing arts workers?
Oh, gosh. This has been an absolutely incredible test. And what I would offer is that the performing arts workers who are weathering this are those who are guided by their purpose to be in this field. There's a lot of talk in almost any professional sector or industry about being passionate and being purpose-driven and being guided by a set of values. For a decentralized, distributed field, the level of personal purpose people feel while unemployed, while furloughed, while scraping together earnings from DoorDash gigs is extraordinary. Earlier, David described a number of coping strategies we asked people about. So we asked what they were doing, but we also asked them why they were doing it. And an incredible number of people actually believe that their coping strategies are directly beneficial to the field, independent of whether they're employed, independent of their age, how long they've been in the field, what their typical jobs are. They are enormously loyal and they believe that their purpose is connected to being part of this work. So as we think about what the positive things are that come out of this crisis, it's that people have distilled down even more their purpose and that this is it.
And David, your thoughts?
I would say that we now have what was previously unimaginable opportunity to actually rebuild and truly rebuild. The old excuses of wanting change, but being too busy, living in that moment, those 16-hour days, or that it's mid-season or mid-tour, we can't change midstream. None of those old excuses are valid. Our house is burned down, or our house was destroyed in a natural disaster. And so now we have to rebuild. But this means that we don't just do an add-on or we don't do some cosmetic. We actually can go back to that foundation. Right? We can actually, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to look at the foundations of how the arts function in the United States, that we're not this luxury. We've proven that we're fundamental, and how we want to govern ourselves and how we want to instill the values within our organizations instead of inheriting other previous generations. This is really a time to start anew, to build off what we've learned in the past, but to really say, this is the Great Fire of Chicago, and then everything built from there. This is nationally within the arts to think about how do we want to move forward.
I would ask each of you your thoughts on, in California, for example, there's a piece of legislation trying to create a creative corps in San Francisco. The mayor's created a creative corps to help artists basically also act as public information folks. And then on a national level, there's been a push as well. Again, it's back to the future, right? Which is coming out of the last Great Depression. We had a national theater organization that the New Deal had created. So what are your thoughts on the idea of the arts being, to Meg's earlier point, really part of the commons, a utility? Thoughts on it being a federally state legislative piece that helps support the arts?
I'm all for it. I don't need to say a lot more. I'm all for it. It's time. The Save Our Stages Act, which is the result of a truly extraordinary coalition-based effort on the private sector side and the public sector side, to be sure. This is a moment not to be ignored. This is the largest public investment in the arts, categorically, in more than a generation. And now that the horse is out of the stable, we have to let it get all the way to the horizon.
I'm really encouraged by the experiments being done on guaranteed income, and to say what should be the base for artists. And so as they do this on small scale, I want to see what some of the impact over 6 months or a year will be within the arts industry. And again, kind of stressing too that we're addressing all performing arts workers. It might be the most visible ones are those performers, say, but to see for the whole field as we kind of regain, because the study itself showed that even without income, people are still being creative, or still making art. So it's just a matter about getting people back on their feet as they continue creating that amazing art.
All right. That was great. Thank you, Meg and David, for sharing the wonderful insights from your research into COVID-19's impact on our performing arts workforce and economy. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, social media, along with links to both reports so they can review the research, hopefully add questions for you to ask, get engaged, and hopefully we'll get some performing arts folks to get engaged in taking the survey. So in the meantime, please stay safe and healthy as we all work our way through this very strange new normal.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of Meg Friedman, a senior consultant at AMS Planning and Research, and David McGraw, the program coordinator for arts administration at Elon University. And we've been discussing their findings, insights, and recommendations from their research project titled Return to the Stage, a Performing Arts Workforce Study. To read, share, and participate in the Return to the Stage study, go to returntothestage.com. For more information about the importance of arts on our economy, listen back on our conversation with John Calden from the San Francisco War Memorial and Performing Arts Center in episode 17, and Randy Rollinson and Allison Snowpecht of Intersection for the Arts in episode 35. With the recent announcement of restrictions being lifted on our small businesses, please tune in to next week's show with Joaquin Torres, who just transitioned out of directing the San Francisco Office of Economic and Workforce Development in a wide-ranging conversation about housing, small businesses, nonprofits, community development, and the arts. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.